This event is hosted by the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, the College of Education and Human Development, and the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. We have faculty on the panel today that represent the three colleges, as well as two of our student representatives that I will announce in just a moment. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded and it will be available for viewing in the future. So we will send out a link to all of the students, as well as those students, faculty, and staff that were not able to be present today, but that would like to view this later. Our session will be about an hour and a half. The first part of the session will be a panel discussion in which I will be moderating. By the way, my name is Gakumo, and I am the Department of Nursing Chair. The second half of the session will be focused on you as the participants. You will have the chance to ask questions of the panel, share your comments or your stories. At this time, if you aren't muted, I believe we have the power to mute everyone. So we have muted you all, just so that we can have clear communication. However, if you have a question or a comment for the second half of the discussion, please post it in the chat box. If, however, you would rather speak, raise your hand, and one of my fellow moderators will unmute you and give you that opportunity. We thought it was really important for those of you who did want to actually lend your voice. There are many ways to do that, but for those of you who would like to verbally speak, that you have the opportunity to do so. We just ask that you remain respectful in tone, and please refrain from using any language that may be offensive to others. So if you would like to raise your hand, the way that you do that is you click on participants in the bottom of the screen, and you'll have a window that will open to the right of your screen, and it will, at the bottom of the right of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says raise hand. You can click on that, and after you're done speaking, click on it again in order to lower your hand. So we ask that you please reserve questions or comments for the second half of the session, and we'll have 45 minutes that we're dedicating just to that. We thought it's important to really have a very vivid conversation with the audience. So I have my moderators that are helping me, Dr. Julie Wright, who is the chair of the Exercise and Health Sciences Department. I also have Dr. Monique Cooper, who is the Senior Director of the Office of Student Success Support and Engagement. Now, I want to say before we begin that it is possible that our discussions can, today can evoke some emotions, right? Maybe strong feelings, and that's okay because we are in a safe space. I think we need to acknowledge that many of us are hurting at this time, and some of us are hurting more than others, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. If for whatever reason anyone in the audience today feels as if they are experiencing psychological distress, anxiety, I will leave you with the contact information of Dr. Cooper, who's on staff with our college. She has a background in counseling, and she works very closely with students, and she's offered her help in that arena. So I do appreciate that, Dr. Cooper. So I want to first begin by taking a moment of silence. Let's use this time to remember those who have recently lost their lives, and also to reflect on the current climate of our country, the state of our country right now, and the need for positive change, which is the purpose for our talk today. So let's just take a moment of silence, if you will. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, the main purpose of this talk is to, talk about current events in our country. Also think of have a discussion to think about, positive ways for social change. And this talk is called Race Revelations, and it's by design. When you think about revelation, you think about something that is revealed to you. And oftentimes that happens in a dramatic way. And so I think that by the end of our time together today, there will be some truths that are revealed to us. I'm expecting everyone that's participating today to leave learning something, or having a better understanding of things that they didn't have before. And so I'm very confident in that. I'd like to introduce my panel at this time. Dr. Leah Gordon is the clinical assistant professor and the track coordinator of the family nurse practitioner track at the UMass Boston Department of Nursing. She has a history of nursing academia that expands working at MGH. She served there as the assistant director of multicultural programming and inclusion. She focused on examining the cultural experiences and health practices of health professionals, and how they can better care for a global world. She is the daughter of a Black American father and a Panamanian mother. And her parents fostered and instilled in her equity ideology. She was a proud single mother of one daughter at age 19. And at that time in her life, she had to rely on public assistance to survive. Throughout her life and academic journey and nursing career, she's faced many challenges as a Black woman. Oftentimes, she was the sole clinician of color in her unit or her department. And she has recognized that she has faced a number of challenges that many of us here have faced as well, especially those who are people of color. Her personal and professional experiences provide a lens that makes her perspective very unique and insightful and important to her roles here in academia. Also, Dr. Laurie Nsiah Jefferson is the director for Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy and the director for Gender Leadership and Policy Program. Her expertise is in the intersectionality between race, women, and health. She has headed a number of efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Heller School. She's also done much of this work at Brandeis University, Simon Fraser University, the University of North Carolina, among others. And so we're very, very thrilled to have her expertise with us today as well. And we have Dr. Joseph Cooper, who is the Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration at UMass Boston. And his research focuses on sport, education, race, and culture, with an emphasis on sport as a catalyst for holistic development. He's authored many peer-reviewed publications and 2 books, and he has spoken extensively about systemic anti-Black violence and activism. We also have 2 student representatives that are with us today. Kira Pressmack, who was an exercise and health sciences major who just recently graduated in May, and was president of the EHS Club. She also played softball for 4 years at our university. And we also have Hundale Ulysses, who is a rising junior in nursing and expects to graduate in May 2022. He aspires to be a PhD prepared nurse practitioner. So without further ado, thank you to all our guests, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first question that I will pose to the panel, and Kira, I'll start with you. We'll get the students' perspective first of all. My first question is, what was your general reaction to watching the death of George Floyd on video? I'm making an assumption here that many of us here have viewed it, but what was your initial reaction in watching it?
I think my initial reaction was anger, unfortunately. I think it was the same way I felt when I saw Eric Gardner's video. It was the same way I felt when I saw Ahmaud Arbery's video. Anger and hurt, and I think confusion as to why this was happening and why this was going on, or why he was, doing that to him. And I think it was kind of also a numb feeling, because that wasn't the first time that I had seen something like that, and which is also very unfortunate. And so I think that was my initial feeling, and now it's just very. If I watch it again, or if I see something like that again, I think it's the same feeling over and over again.
Thank you, Kara, for sharing that. Dr. Gordon, would you like to give your thoughts?
Sure. I just want to thank you and the College of Nursing and Health Sciences for hosting an event like this and asking me to be a panelist. I really appreciate that our dean recognizes the importance of this type of dialogue. I want to be clear to those who are attending that I want to share the message that your Black and Brown friends and colleagues are not okay. We are hurting deeply. And with that said, the last time I watched a video of violence towards a Black man was Michael Brown, and I really haven't watched since then, because although I know our society is more engaged with technology and social media, I just cannot allow myself to be desensitized by seeing the brutality against Black men and women in any video form. But with that said, I don't think that I needed to watch the video, knowing the inherent history of our country as it relates to Black and Brown individuals, to understand that 1 and 1 equal 2, and to understand what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, to Breonna Taylor, and to Mr. Floyd. And I carry, very similar to what Kira was saying, this rage and this anger, and feel like this kind of numb state that I walk the earth in is further enhanced by knowing that this action happened. And just from the stills that I've seen, the fact that this officer could look dead into the camera, the framing of his face, of Mr. Floyd's face, carried enough impact for me to feel all of the similar things that Kara just expressed.
Thank you for sharing that. I hear the words numb and being desensitized, and I can definitely relate after seeing it for the first time. And I didn't finish watching the entire video, but I just recall thinking in my head, oh gosh, not again. And so it's pretty moving in a bad way. So Laurie, or excuse me, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, I'd like to move to you and ask another question. What has happened to George Floyd and other men of color and women in our country as of late has created this strong visceral reaction, more so now than in times in the past? And I'm wondering, and this isn't just in the U.S. It is on a global level, which is pretty incredible. I'm wondering what's different about this time. I mean, certainly, at this point, unfortunately, we've, as Dr. Gordon mentioned, we've seen a number of Black bodies in the street, people that are being choked to death, unfortunately. But what do you think is different about this time, these instances, that are creating such an uprising?
I've been talking about this with, friends and family and colleagues for, the last, week or two. And, but before I do that, I want to sort of give you some examples of, how things have changed so that people can sort of see that context. So it seems like in a span of, a week, for a few days, the death of a white policeman's knee, the death of a black man who was killed by a white policeman's knee on his neck became this parable in America around the racial story. And what's really very, very interesting is that this particular video, along with Mr. Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the Karen incident in the park, really, really seemed to hit this chord. And what we see was that these incidents disrupted politics, business, culture, sports, academia. It spanned continents, sparking debates and reflections across the Atlantic and in Europe and also in Africa. And it's really very interesting because, Mr. Floyd was somebody who was barely known outside of his circles. And he was able, with his dying words, "I can't breathe," which again, Eric Garner also noted, is something that he is going to, his death, and I always have to say this because I'm a spiritual person, his death had such strong, incredible meaning, and it will make a difference. So we had Drew Brees admitting that, he needs to do more listening than he needs to do talking. The NFL admitted they were wrong. European sports car stars are taking a knee to honor Floyd. In Britain, they are demanding that statues and authors of colonialism are torn down. In France, they are outlawing chokeholds. But let me give you an idea of, why I think this is happening. I think that, first of all, we know that there's been police murders of 1,000 per year or more. And then we also know that there's little or no accountability for police misconduct in reference to killing and injuries. In addition to that, what was also going on is that there's COVID-19, and COVID-19 was negatively affecting us in terms of health outcomes, due to underlying conditions in regards to those who are most exposed. So we knew that it was people of color who were exposed to this particular disease more, given their particular jobs. In addition to that, we also know that in terms of economic impact, it was also more of people of color. So you had economic disparities, you had health disparities. On top of that, people in America went in lockdown. They were not as preoccupied with work. In addition to that, they had more time to watch TV and hear news commentary. In addition to that, they were also in a place of frustration and fear and dislike in reference to things going on in the country. The killings were also on tape. Everybody could see them. In addition to that, we were also able to see the videoed incident in Central Park. The Donald Trump factor was coming together at the same time in terms of him he did use the military against his own people, being the American people. And so what you were seeing, and then people in other countries were also identifying with the racism in America that was also the racism that they were seeing. So what I think I'm saying in a nutshell, there was a confluence of factors. There was a perfect storm. There were about 9 or 10 different factors that were going on. COVID-19, police violence, economic insecurity in this country. And putting all that together created a really, really perfect storm for outrage. And can I say one last thing? And I think also people, particularly white America, is now having permission to say that Black Lives Matter. And what I mean by that, the more people in power and the more people of influence who are saying this is wrong gives Americans permission to say, okay, this is okay to say this is wrong. So it's coming from our own conscience, but it's also coming from elites as well.
Thank you, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, and you've given us a lot to unpack. So I want to touch on several of those factors that you've just mentioned. And Dr. Cooper, I'll go to you next. Let's talk about the use of police force, right? So can you tell me of perhaps some of the experiences that, this question is twofold. One, can you tell me of some of the experiences that you're aware of or had regarding bias and discrimination among law enforcement? And, you know, my second question is, we're hearing a lot of talk about defunding the police. What does that concept mean to you, and what are your feelings on it?
Thank you, Dr. Gakumo. First of all, the police brutality in force, I want everybody to understand, just echoing what Dr. Gordon and Dr. Jefferson said, when we see these murders happen the way they do, in the frequency they do, there are pre-existing societal conditions that facilitate that type of harm to be inflicted on certain bodies. And I think it's important that the enraged feelings, the emotions that are generated when we witness a single act, I think we need to, if we're serious about humanity, and I do want to make it clear that Black people are human beings, not subhuman, as was defined in the original Constitution of the United States, where Blacks were deemed 3/5 of a person. Not objects for experimentation in the case of the Tuskegee experiment, Black women in North Carolina being sterilized against their will. You know, this history of viewing Blacks as objects or as animals or less than humans is pervasive in our society overall. And I'm going to connect it to the police brutality. So when you have an educational system that largely ignores the histories of African people, when you've got a healthcare system and a housing residential system that segregates services and quality of services and access to resources largely based on the color of your skin as well as your socioeconomic status, you've already created an apparatus for that society to say, I can do certain things to certain bodies without penalty. So the officers who are engaging in that are operating within a system that has already empowered them to engage in that type of degradation. So when I think about the police state, we have to go back to the history of why were police created in the first place. And we know that particularly during the Jim Crow era and prior to with chattel slavery, a large part of this quote unquote law enforcement wasn't to protect the rights of everybody in a community. It was to protect those who are Euro white Americans. And I do hope that in this conversation, all of us, it's important to add specificity to our claims. We need to honor all of the groups that have faced oppression: Indigenous people, Latinos, Latina Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, multiracial people, because there's a particular, at least in the work that I do, and particularly as it pertains to police violence, anti-Black racism towards that are committed by police is a particular issue, and that we need to talk about it. And we need to be able to say that there's a particular type of violence against Black people. So that part to me is very important in order to understand the police brutality. You have to feel emboldened, as Dr. Gordon mentioned, that officer looked in the camera with the confidence that I will not be convicted of this, even if you record me. Because if we look at a majority of these cases, the high profile cases over the past 6 or 7 years, there's been very few convictions with ample evidence to say that these people were unjustly murdered. So that to me is an important point to take away. And if you could just remind me the second part of your question.
About defunding the police. So as you know, recently there's been over the past week, there's been a huge call to defund the police. And there are, you know, people who are for that, people who are against it, people that, you know, have different interpretations of what this means. So what does this mean to you?
For me, I once again, I just ask for specificity. I think I heard Senator Kamala Harris say the other day, and I'm not getting into all of her politics, but one statement that she made that I agree with is this idea of what is effective solutions to improving the plight of communities that are underserved and that have been economically deprived. If you believe that more police officers on the street, or if you believe more militarization of a police force is the answer, I strongly disagree with that. I think if you address some of the antecedents to what is deemed as criminal, because I think in many cases, bodies are being criminalized, people are being criminalized when we know that certain crimes happen in other communities, but people are not arrested at the same rates. We also know the conditions in certain communities, such as systemic poverty, such as food deserts, food swamps, right? All of these conditions are going to create certain, what in the public health sector is called social determinants. There's direct correlations and causations to certain types of behaviors, regardless of what racial group is under them. So for me, it's less about just defunding the police. I think we do need to examine how police are being funded, where are those funds being used, and is that the most effective way to address some of the issues impacting these communities? But I don't think just a blanket statement of defunding without specificity is the answer.
I agree with that, and I'll go to you, Dr. Gordon, and then Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, you next. Definitely, I agree that in large part it means not abolishing, the police force, but looking at ways to redirect some of the funds for better social change. For example, oftentimes police officers are called when there's like a mental health issue. Do they have the training and background to handle such situations, or should we be using those monies for other ways to address such issues? Dr. Gordon?
So I want to piggyback on what you were just saying, because I know some of our audience members are faculty and students in the College of Nursing and Health Sciences. When I think about situations in the hospital, if somebody comes in to the emergency room and they're distraught, they're upset, they're a bit combative, yes, we have security around, standing at the doors, keeping things under control, right? But what do I, as a nurse practitioner, want to happen in that room, especially if somebody is clearly experiencing a mental health issue? I want a nurse in the room. I want the physician in the room. I want social work in the room, and potentially psychiatry in the room. So here are the things that we do in a hospital to address people who we're concerned about. Police are not nurses. They're not social workers. They're not psychiatry. They're not physicians. I don't think we should be asking the police to do this. So when I agree with what Dr. Cooper's saying, when we're talking about defunding the police, I don't think anybody's saying we don't want public safety to exist. We don't want some sort of mechanism of regulating public safety to exist. But I actually would counter and say, I don't want the number of funds to go to the police if we can have social work with police and de-escalate situations. Now, with that said, post 9/11, our police departments, our local police departments became highly militarized. So you go to these, an individual goes to these protests and you see police with batons, tasers, guns, attire that is heightening, that is escalating. And we look to law enforcement to de-escalate. But if they're showing up and they're already ready for a fight, the tide begins to turn in these situations. And I want to point out to people that nationwide and locally, many of these protests have been peaceful. There certainly has been an element of riot and or looting, but I think people need to understand a few things as it relates to that. One, if you're dealing with vulnerable people who are already marginalized, who already feel taken advantage of and taken for granted, and then a police force shows up and they're in a uniform that's escalating their feelings, their vulnerability, it's not surprising to me that some level of rioting would occur. I think Dr. King said that rioting is the unheard voice of individuals, or I can't remember the exact saying, but it's not surprising. To me, there's a true delineation between those who show up to protest, those who show up and get a little amped up because the situation is amped up, and then those who come to loot. Those who come to, like, for example, let's take Boston, right? Those individuals who went over to Newbury Street, who looted, were there to loot. They weren't part of the protest. They went there with a certain intention. But when you think about the vulnerability of these marginalized communities, and you see an opportunity when you're in a COVID situation, you're isolated, you cannot access resources, and you're now being told your city's gonna start phasing of getting reopened, and maybe you need to have that suit to go to to go to an interview to get yourself a job. I don't really see how people can how they can't delineate in their mind why somebody might take advantage of going into that Macy's window and getting a suit for the job that they need to get to stay alive and survive, especially when they're part of marginalized communities that are already in a specific place due to systems of being oppressed.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. And Hundell, I might have lost you. I see your screen is black. I want to come to you if I can. Are you there, Hundell? Okay, sorry. I wanted to get your, thank you. I wanted to get your experiences, and Dr. Jefferson, I'll come to you next. Some of the things that Dr. Cooper touched on about police use of force. I'm wondering if you have any personal experiences that, as a Black man, you've experienced in your interactions with police or law enforcement.
Yeah, I can definitely speak on a situation. Although I wasn't a victim of police brutality in a physical form, I know that there was an interaction that did, in fact, traumatize me as it relates to last summer. I was in downtown Crossing with a mentor and two other friends of mine we were all people of color. And we were essentially just enjoying the summer, looking for activities to do in downtown Crossing. As soon as we left the station, and we were like right outside, we were approached by three officers. One officer that was Hispanic, one officer that was Black, and another officer, a female officer that was Caucasian. And initially, we were just asked to provide identification, very aggressively, no context at all. And we complied. We understood the situation at hand. Luckily for me, I had my ID in the back of my phone, so I didn't need to reach in my pocket for any form of identification. I just pulled out my license from my phone and handed it over. But in the midst of all of this, we had the right to ask the reason we were being detained. So we proceeded to do so. And almost every time we did, we were ignored. And it took to a point of my mentor, who was much older than all of us, to ask, and then he was finally responded, but also with aggression. So once we finally understood the reason why we were being detained, we were told that it's because there was a recent shoplifting that had occurred and we had fit the description. Once we asked to see what these people look like, we were told, well, we saw visually that the people who were being identified did not actually match up to us in the clothing at all. It was simply just the skin color that made us match the description. And my friend had begun to have his backpack searched by the police. And this was all done very quickly and aggressively. So it doesn't really give you time to ask questions or react. But as soon as they had showed us the footage and they realized that we were not the people, they were very quick to dismiss the situation and just completely disregard, as if nothing had just happened, as if they didn't just corner us, evoking a sense of anxiety. So there was a conversation that was dismantled between myself and the female Caucasian officer, and I asked her, you know, it's tough to establish a sense of rapport and a good relationship with civilians if you guys just downright approach people and you guys don't actually look at the clothing of the color they're wearing, and you just assume that they are the people because they're Black. And I was responded with, well, you know, that's the reason why we didn't have to pull out our guns on you guys. You guys seem to be very educated young men. And for me, the message that I took from that is, if I was someone who had anxiety to a point where my parents didn't teach me how to appropriately respond to that situation, I could have gotten killed. Not handcuffed, not reprimanded, not not in any other way, just outright cold blood killed. So it led to a continuous factor of asking for that the police has a proper retraining, and Boston Police Department, along with a letter of complaint. But to this day, and this is even after the commissioner came in and spoke to my mentor and I had an interview to better understand the situation that was at hand, they were the message that was given to us is that there was no reporting of the actual shoplifting incident. There was actually no record to be found of that situation. So it leaves us to this day wondering if those reforming measures will be actually taking place, and if those officers will actually be taught how to approach civilians who, for instance, may have not been eligible to react to that situation, because this is in a sense what allows for the escalation of killings in our society, not just in the US but globally, because Black people are seen as a weapon just because of the color of their skin. And when I say Black people, this is people of color. This is all, like Dr. Cooper mentioned, indigenous, Latinx populations. So it's a common issue that I feel like needs to be resolved.
Absolutely, I agree.
Can I just give two quick examples, just real quick before Dr. Jefferson?
Yes.
So Handel was talking about what happened in Boston. I have a family member who was in his 60s in Aberdeen, Maryland, a military officer and in a high position as a chief medical officer, was running in his neighborhood, predominantly white neighborhood. He quote unquote fit the description, and he's about 5'10", gray hair, older man, and the police officers put him down on the concrete, very similar to how they did George Floyd. And subsequently, they found out that they were looking for a 27-year-old Black male who was much taller, different complexion, no gray hair. And this is an individual. So just echoing what Handel is saying is that it's the idea that your body is a threat and you're criminalized. And this was an individual who was in the military, older seniors, a senior citizen age, and was a medical officer and still experienced that. When I was in college, one of my best friends and I were leaving a gas station. We had hoodies on and we were pulled over because we fit the description. And the officer asked us, "Where are you going? Why do you have hoodies on?" And I asked myself, is it illegal to wear a hoodie? Like, did you stop the two white females who left at the same time as our gas station, at the same gas station, if they were wearing hoodies? And so just to echo what Handel is saying, and it fits the description of the times, everybody, we have a pandemic of racism in our society that preceded the pandemic of coronavirus. Handel just gave an example that he personally experienced in Boston. I gave an example of me in North Carolina and an example that happened in Maryland. And then we have countless examples across the country. This is a pandemic and we should respond accordingly.
I agree. I could share examples personally myself that I'll reserve for perhaps another time. I do want to shift gears a bit, and thank you both for sharing your experiences, to the concept of Black Lives Matter, right? So we know in our country recently more people are accepting that. There's less of a resistance. So I'm gonna go to you, Dr. Jefferson, and then I'm gonna come back to you, Dr. Cooper, as well as Kara, to talk about the notion of Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. So what do you say to people who say, well, all lives matter because it encompasses all races and people of all backgrounds? Should there be a distinction made between Black Lives Matter and all lives matter? I'm sorry, I'll start with Dr. Jefferson. And you're on mute.
Yeah, just before I talk about that, I do just want to mention a couple of things that get back to some of the things that, you know, Joseph was mentioning and also Handel was mentioning a few minutes ago. I think that when we start thinking about, you know, the inhumanity of individuals, they come in all stripes. We look at young men who are demonized, who are considered in many instances to be dangerous before you even know them, before you even look at them. We also know that, and this is something that I find to be profoundly problematic, is we have preschool children who are, there's a disproportionate number of preschool children who are actually kicked out of preschool because they are considered to be very, very, you know, poorly behaved children. They're doing the same thing that a white child is doing. And I bring that up only to say that there's studies that show that by the time a child, whether it's a female or a male, is 5 years old, they are considered to be older and more culpable for their particular behaviors. I also want to mention, before I get to the Black Lives Matter, we have grandmothers, we have little children. Ayanna Stanley was 7 years old, she was killed. We had grandmothers. Now you think about a grandmother who's in a wheelchair, who can't barely move. How is she a threat to a police officer? We also have to think about the fact that when we think about Black women are many instances, you know, both targeted by police, but they're also collateral damage. They're considered to be drug mules. They're considered to be individuals who in many ways are supporting their men. I think the other thing that's really important to think about is collateral damage in terms of how do we, as Black people, parent our children. You know, we have to parent our children very, very differently. And one of the things Handel said that I think was critically important was the fact that, you know, if he had not done the right thing, but also sometimes you do everything that is correct and right, and you are still killed by the police officers. So I think that when we're thinking about killings by police officers, and this is going to get into the Black Lives Matter piece, is that it's not even just a physical injury in death that results from police violence. There's also economic ills. People lose their family members. People lose breadwinners. In addition to that, there's also psychological and emotional damage, because at the end of the day, we have what we call anticipatory racism. We're always ready for the next shoe to drop. And that could be, like, for instance, when I'm driving down the street and there is a police car behind me, I always get heart palpitations every single time. And God forbid I get stopped, because when I get stopped, I am really, really afraid. And, you know, I do whatever I can. And sometimes that means be quiet. Other times that means, like, you know, just doing what I can. So I'm saying there's psychological harm, there's economic harm. And then there's also, you know, cancers and, you know, heart disease and things like that happen because racism is a stressor, and we all know it's a stressor. Now I'm going to end this. This is one of the reasons why it's important to distinguish between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, because at the end of the day, there are people who will say, but, you know, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter. That is a given. If we are humans in society, we will assume that all lives matter. But what ends up happening is that there's a reason why we're having to say that Black Lives Matter. It gets back to what Leah was talking about. It gets back to what Joseph was talking about, and Handel was talking about. At the end of the day, we have been dehumanized. We are not considered people. What I was doing the other day, I was thinking about Juneteenth Day. And, you know, that is celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. Interestingly enough, I decided, let me take some time to read the Emancipation Proclamation. And when I read the first few paragraphs of it, you know, it talked about, you know, as an emancipated individual, you will have rights to move about safely. You will not be an enemy. There are a number of different sayings and text within the Emancipation Proclamation. And sadly to say, if you read that document in terms of what emancipation means, we as Black people are not emancipated. and there's also brown people in this country that are not emancipated. So the reason that we have to say that Black Lives Matter is because there is a consciousness in society that is lacking the fact that we do matter in terms of, police, in terms of our educational system, in terms of our economic system. We are not given the same rights. We are not viewed as being equal in many instances. And therefore, it is a reminder, it is a wake-up call. And when I hear that all lives matter, I feel as though, and this is where I get angry, when I hear it, it's like, are you trying to neutralize our message? We're saying it because we have to, because Black lives have not mattered. So I just wanted to, bring that to the fore. And I think that we need to have discussions, and I think we can have civil discussions as to letting people understand that, yes, their life matters, but there's a reason why we have to emphasize, and it is around emphasizing that point.
Thank you, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson. Dr. Gordon?
I was just going to say that, so when people say all lives matter, it's a bit frustrating to me because all lives do matter, but all lives can't matter until Black lives matter, that Black lives can be included in that equation. And when I hear people say all lives matter, it signals me that they're not in a space where they're prepared to really delve deeply into what the inherent issue is. So for example, in nursing academia and across the board in many spheres, you hear about microaggressions, macroaggressions, implicit bias. All these concepts are really important, but if we're not talking about the actual elephant in the room, which is racism, we're not going to get anywhere. So when I look at individuals using all lives matter as much as a sidestep to the real conversation that needs to take place around racism, as I do when people want to focus on microaggressions, macroaggressions, and implicit bias. Yes, those things exist. They are true concepts. Yes, all lives matter. It's true. But if we're not addressing the true elephant in the room, which is racism, systemic racism, and how it is impacting on people of color, then for me, that's a signaling that either an individual is not ready to have the kind of conversation that is necessary to move the agenda forward, or the individual is just not interested in acknowledging maybe that they have racist tendencies. So I feel like when people say those things, or when they say decolonizing education, decolonizing things, defunding the police, if that gets people's, or getting rid of white supremacy, if that gets people's backs up, I think it's a barometer for them to internally check in with themselves. Because if saying Black Lives Matter affects somebody like that, I think they need to turn inward and sort of check themselves on why that term would be problematic for them, specifically in this day and age.
I agree. And I think just the concept of racism, it makes people uncomfortable. And I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Gordon, we need to have our feathers ruffled. So, the more that we can continue to have these hard conversations and reveal these truths that exist, the better we'll be as people. Kara, did you have a comment about the concept of Black Lives Matter? And before you answer, Kira, I would like to, we're at the point where we're going to transition. And so if you have some, for the people that are in the audience, if you have some comments or questions that you would like to share, please do so in the chat box. Also, if you would like to actually verbally make a comment or ask a question, click on raise your hand and I'll have the moderator to recognize you so that you can do that. Kira?
Yes, so I think with the conversation with Black Lives Matter, I think a lot of people unfortunately treat it as though it's a trend, or treat it as though it's a hashtag, or treat it as though it's something cool to be a part of. And that is simply not the case. And I think when comparing it to All Lives Matter, it's kind of like saying, I think the best comparison to put it against is, you know, we have different months and different colors and different ribbons for cancers and diseases and things of that nature. So when we have like a breast cancer awareness month, you know, nobody is saying that colon cancer doesn't matter. Nobody is saying that skin cancer doesn't matter. We're just bringing awareness to the cancer that matters at this moment. And right now, Black Lives Matter at this moment. And like one of my friends said, the BLM, it's a movement. It's not a moment. So it's a movement that is supposed to encourage people, that is supposed to inspire people to not just hop along with it, but to join it and to join us and to join us in our fight. And, you know, we as Black people, we never said white lives don't matter. We never said none of Indigenous lives don't matter, Hispanic lives don't matter. Nobody has ever said any of that. But the fact that our lives we're dying, you know, people are killing us just by the way we look. And so for us to bring awareness to that, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think a lot of people, I guess they don't understand it for some reason, because they have no issue saying all lives matter. They have no issue saying blue lives matter, but they do have an issue saying Black lives matter. And I think Dr. Gordon, I definitely agree with that fact that they have to look internally. They have to look within themselves to see why are you getting upset that we're saying this, you know? So I think that is my take on that.
Thank you, Kira. Handel, you had a comment to add.
Yeah, I think a good analogy that would help people to understand the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter is if you were to take, and I'll give two examples. If you were to take a house that was burning, some of you may have heard of this analogy already before. If a house is burning on a street with multiple other houses, the people who are at the houses where it is not burning are not going to say, hey, well, my house matters too. Why aren't you putting out the fire in all of the houses? When the situation that needs to be focused is that there's one house that's on fire. And if you use that group, the group of people of color, and you identify them as that house, in the street where we have a melting pot of all houses, signifying different cultures and different racial backgrounds, you have to understand that to say that my house matters too while another house is burning is almost devaluing the importance of that house being burnt down with people inside of it. And another analogy is if you have a mother bird who has, let's say, 12 baby birds, and one is wounded, she's gonna band-aid the wound of that one bird. The other birds are not gonna say, well, what about us? We matter too, because the attention is on the current wound that has been inflicted. So that's my best takeaway on that. And that's really all I have to say in regards to understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, because I have met people who it's hard for them to grasp the importance of this movement.
Yes, all the more reason for us to be here to help enlighten one another. So thank you for those analogies. Those were wonderful. So I have a few comments here to the left of the screen. Again, it's 12:55, so it is time for us to open up the larger conversation to our audience out in the crowd. There was a comment made by Melanie. Thank you everyone for being here. I question whether you have the same rights, but they are not upheld, which is why I think the medium between the police and whoever they are arresting or questioning needs to be present to hold the police accountable of their actions. Quote unquote, fitting a description outrages me to hear. It is an unjustified action and part of the brutality that they need to be held accountable for. Another question or comment from Adab. Thank you all. As international student who is brown, I have experienced the racism, both micro and macro. I'm so happy to have such an event to talk about it. Thank you very much. There's a question from Bonnie. Does the panel have any action items for me? A white, affluent, older nurse practitioner. So thank you, Bonnie, for posing that question. This is definitely something that we want to begin to tackle. We not only want to talk about experiences and the structural racism that exists in our country, but we also want to be able to enlighten or share, with others of what are the steps to action. So who would like to take this question?
I can speak on this.
Sure, Hundell and then Dr. Gordon.
Okay. I was just gonna say, I think there are many different routes we can take, and I know we're very short on time, so I'll try to be brief. One of the methods I think we can take is if you know people of color who are in school, who are students, and you have, for instance, board of trustees meetings, any meetings that allow for funding for people of color, whether it may be for diseases, illnesses, housing, and you know that they work in those organizations, please welcome them into those conversations. If you know individuals who are interested in speaking on committees where there are legislative bills being passed, include them in those conversations, because in order to see true change, we need to also incorporate the people who are being the most oppressed in those conversations. We need to incorporate their voices so that they can be heard, and so they almost also have input on the decisions that are being made.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hundell. Dr. Gordon, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, certainly as the track coordinator for the FNP program, that's the Family Nurse Practitioner Program. I think it's really important for our students, if they haven't already, to really think about taking a deeper dive into not only our US history, but our medical history. Dr. Cooper spoke about the Tuskegee study, but I actually would implore people to go back a little bit further and look at the antebellum experiments that took place on Black slaves, which includes some of what Doctor was talking about. There was a statue of a Dr. Sims in Central Park that was taken down in 2017. He's the individual who was doing medical experimentation on Black female slaves. So many of the things that we know about in healthcare right now, the natural history of how syphilis affects the brain, we know because that took place on Black men who were part of a study that they didn't even know that they were part of, that was funded by healthcare and the government. The things we know about gynecologic procedures happened because this Black slave, her name was Lucy, that's how they defined her, had all these experiments done on her without anesthesia, without antibiotics that were available at that time, right? So then think about situations like, I don't know if people are familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cell, and how informative the HeLa cell has been in cancer and AIDS research. But that came at a cost of a family a family at Johns Hopkins that was Black, treated in separate units, and these cells were found to be so beneficial that they didn't even tell the family that these cells were being used. So I implore people to take a deeper dive into the history, especially the medical history if they're healthcare professionals, to understand the disconnect between communities of color and healthcare. The other thing I want to mention that I think is really important for people to look into is this concept of anchor institutions. This is something that was developed in, I believe, 2009 by HUD, I think it was Housing and Development portion of the government, and it basically instills foundational higher education and hospitals in communities that don't have the intention of leaving, to further invest in those communities. So BMC in 2017, they gave $6.5 million to their anchor institution project that focused on one of the social determinants of health, which is housing, and making housing more affordable in and around the Boston medical area, not only for their patients, but for their employees who are people of color who are also in disparate populations. Now, I just want to have people keep in mind, in 2017, BMC did this, but in 2017, Dr. Ben Carson was also made the head of HUD. So I think we need to keep our eyes on what happens with that when an institution, an anchor institution's true intention is to help community, but there are people in the background who who may not have those same intentions and who have a little bit more power and authority, which is concerning. So I think one of the questions you had asked was, or were planning to ask, was about voting. And this is where I think voting is really necessary. We can vote individuals in and give them the authority, keep an eye on them, hold them accountable, but we can also vote them out if they're not doing what we as the public said we wanted them to do, or they were committed to do when they were campaigning. So again, learning the history, looking into things like anchor institutions, and if we are in an anchor institution or you work in an anchor institution, how you can affirm that commitment through your work. I would say that would be the answer to that nurse practitioner's question.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gordon. And certainly, I think when you speak of, or when we speak of voting, oftentimes, you know, the majority of the people come out every 4 years to vote, you know, for the president, but, you know, it's less so, you know, when it's time to vote for legislators who really make the laws, and, you know, or even your local commissioner, you know, we need to educate ourselves on these things. And just from a historical perspective, Henrietta Lacks is the reason that there's a cure for polio, right? And I just know from being a graduate of Tuskegee University, I'm originally from Alabama. I remember I was a freshman in college at the time. This was President Bill Clinton was president at the time, and it was 1996 or 97, and he visited our university. He made a public apology, and I remember the feeling from the local side as well as the people in academia. In academia, people were like, "Oh, it's so exciting! The president, he's coming. He's putting millions of dollars worth, building this center for ethics." But on the local side, people were like, you know, too little, too late. At that time, it was half a century later, after the Tuskegee syphilis study, that there was a formal apology from the U.S. government. It took nearly half a century. That's a problem, right? So let's go back to our questions, courses of action. So are there other comments? We have additional questions as well. So would anyone else like to chime in on courses of action? Dr. Cooper, and then Dr. Nsiah Jefferson.
And I'll be happy, and I've been sharing a couple of resources in the chat, and I'll be able to happy to share more. But just kind of generally to everybody, courses of actions, every one of us in this chat and everybody in the world changes the world every day through your actions and your inactions. And so the idea is to try to understand that all of us were born into a society that already had pre-existing norms, ideologies, structures, institutions. So rather than saying, oh, I personally did not enslave somebody, I personally did not pass that bill that experimented on people in inhumane ways, I personally didn't create low-income environments. Think about ways in which you can leverage your identities, your resources, your privileges to enact change, right? So everybody has different positions that they can play, and more than one thing. I always tell my students that you have multiple purposes in life. A lot of times say, I'm trying to find my purpose, trying to find that career, but you have multiple purposes and you have multiple resources that you can use. The number one thing that you all are doing on this panel or participating today is to listen, learn, and educate yourselves. Oftentimes we can empower ourselves more when we just listen, because there's other people who've been doing certain types of work for longer and have more information, and we can take that and use that in a way to empower people. So what I would say is take the onus and take the courage to be anti-racist, to be anti-sexist, to be anti-ableist. Everybody, at least on this call, has some access to internet. There's a plethora of resources, and we'll try to provide it to you in a more condensed fashion. But there's a lot of great work that's happening, a lot of transformative work, whether it's in the form of advocacy, activism, and it's just a matter of telling yourself, what can I do? What are certain things that I know that maybe consciously or unconsciously I've perpetuated? So for example, ask yourself, have I walked past a Black man or a Black woman and clutched my purse or walked away? Did I do that? Do I automatically assume if I see somebody, we all have implicit biases. We all have it's Audre Lorde said, it's not our differences that divide us, it's our inability to celebrate, respect, and validate those differences. So recognize that we are all different, but we all are human beings. And if you believe that everybody deserves human dignity, you can't look at the current landscape of our society and say that everything's fair. You can't look at, for example, me as a Black man. Black men, adult men of over the age of 18, only constitute 3% of the US population. 3%. That means 97% of the people in this country are not adult Black men. But we constitute over roughly 38% of the prison population. Can anybody, if your particular group, say that there's that much of a disparity? And there are other oppressed groups who can give similar examples. So I'm not saying Black men are the only one, but just think about that. Another example as it pertains to our current climate with police brutality. Any of us can say that it's normal to see the group that you belong to depicted on the news being suffocated to death multiple times, not in a movie, but like real images, a whole video. To see people of your identity and background to be laying in the street for hours, a corpse of their body laying in the street. Back to what Dr. Jefferson was saying, this is what we mean by trauma-induced responses, right? And so understanding that those individual instances are connected to how our society is structured. And the more you can understand, okay, there's multiple levers to what's going on. How can I use my agency to address as many of those levers during my lifetime as possible? And it goes from the interpersonal level, who you interact with, like Handel and Kiera was saying about representation. If you're in a position to bring people in groups that are typically historically marginalized or underrepresented, that's an act of change. So there's a lot of ways in which you can do things. So don't underestimate the power that you have as one individual.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing several comments and questions.
Can't hear you.
You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. So I'm reading. I have several comments to the side, so I'll try to get to them all. From Crystal Gale, hi everyone. Thank you so much for doing this panel. I am curious to see how the panelists address the intersections of race and policing. From Handel's example, a Black officer and a Hispanic officer were there as co-participants to the marginalization of them and viewing them as suspects. And so what are your thoughts on that, Handel, that, you know, these were police who were also men of color that were contributing to the marginalization and the misperceptions of you? What are your thoughts on that?
I believe that racism in itself comes in all forms, in all colors. It's not specifically one group that does it. And I think that to an extent, there are parts of the justice system that encourages racism based off of the way that it is designed. And to be fair, I think that a lot of what needs to be done, and I know some people mentioned it in the chat as well, is continuous involvement of women of color as well, when we're also including that Black Lives Matter, because it is true in the sense that Black Lives Matter is commonly referenced towards the Black men who have been killed. However, there are multiple women who have been killed in the hands of police brutality, such as Sandra Bland, such as Breonna Taylor, and the list goes on. So I think it's sad to see that people of color also, as police, are oppressing other people of color, but it just goes to show how deep systemic racism has affected their mental state and has allowed them to think it is okay to, for instance, search one of my friend's backpack without a warrant and assume that they don't know their rights, assume that they don't know the rights that they uphold by being an American citizen. So I think a lot of work that definitely needs to be done towards that, but it definitely comes with mental change, therapy, because this is generational depression we're talking about that is affecting the reason why they act this way.
Thank you. So a couple of comments on the chat box, and then I'm going to move to Carmen. Hold that thought, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson. Just additional resources, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is a great book. There's one question, well, actually, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, if you will, finish your thought, and then I'll get to Rosanna's question.
Well, I think in terms of the point that was just being raised about, you know, other men of color actually having inaction in the face of what was happening with George Floyd. I studied public health and health policy, and so I see there's a parallel between doctors of color, nurses of color, other health professionals of color, in some instances are also providing poor quality care, discriminatory care toward their own people, just as the police officers are. And so it's not specifically about the color of your skin always. And that's not to say, and I'm going to be very clear about this, it's not to say that we don't need to diversify the healthcare system in terms of workers, nor do we need to diversify the system in terms of policing, because we know that there's racial concordance does make a difference in terms of compliance and acceptance of care. But what I'm saying is that doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals, as are police officers, they are trained into a system. That system is a dominant system that provides the values and the ways of behavior that are accepted. So what ends up happening, particularly for some individuals of color, is that they are trying to be accepted in a system in which they're not normally accepted. So there may be a compliance along with behavior that does not seem to correct. So this is not always about your racial identity, but it's about a power structure and a system that predominates, that is the one that people tend to move forward towards. So I think that's really critically important, because we say, well, how can this possibly happen? We know about internalized racism as well. I mean, this comment about the white man's ice is always colder. And so at the end of the day, sometimes we do things to our own people by virtue of the fact that part of this domination narrative is to make you not like yourself as an individual or as a people. So I think it's important that we try to, on some levels, complicate. It is not about just race and ethnicity. It is about power and structures. And we really didn't take a long time to talk about the whole concept of structural racism and how that actually fits into this particular, this particular issue that we're talking about today around the intersection of policing and race.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping that we can have a few minutes to talk about that. I mean, those structures have been in place for hundreds of years, and how do we begin to break those down? I'm going to ask a question from Rosanna, and then Carmen, I saw your hand up, so I'll go to you next. Rosanna asks, how do Black feminists or womanists fit in the Black Lives Matter thought or movement? Do Black women matter? Dr. Gordon, and then Kara.
And I also want to say something on that too, if I can.
Okay.
We certainly do matter. I think people need to recall that Black Lives Matter was started by 3 females. There is going to be a list of resources that's provided, and there's a book called Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper, who speaks about her feminism, her intersection of feminism and her culture, and how that comes together. And I think obviously nursing, which is a profession that I'm part of, is a female-oriented, dominant profession. We still love our male nurses, but I mean, let's be honest, we know that there's more women in nursing. And I think that this is a really great time for us to elevate our voices as a profession that is female, that is predominantly female. Certainly needs a lot more diversification in it. Yeah, I think our voices are truly important. And I think that utilizing our voices in the settings that we work in can sometimes be intimidating because we worry about retaliation and things like that. But I think that there's a way that we can express and convey our thoughts and our concerns, not only as it relates to us, but and I'm speaking as about us as people of color, but also as it relates to our communities and how we know healthcare disparities exist. So for example, I am an NP in oncology. Oncology is pervasive with healthcare disparities. I'm constantly asking the people that I work with, why are we not seeing more Black and brown faces in a minority majority city? In and around the hospital where I work, so elevating our voices at the table, making sure, as Hendel said, that we take a look around and see who's at the table and ask ourselves who's missing from this conversation. And I think oftentimes we have the affordability and as members of the nursing profession to actually say that there's a Black woman in the space who should be at this table, and we should involve them and encourage them to participate.
Thank you, Kiara.
Yes, I definitely completely agree. I don't see, I think my question to that question is, why wouldn't we matter? And why wouldn't we be a part of that conversation? And I'm just going to say this really quickly. I know like we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but Black women being in sports, I am a softball player and I've been playing softball my whole life. And, being a Black woman in a predominantly white sport, it hasn't been easy. It's not easy at all. And I think that when it comes to Black women being a part of the Black Lives Matter conversation, that goes back to what Dr. Cooper said about, being anti-sexist. It has to deal with the men in our community. It has to deal with people thinking that Black gay people a part of the LGBTQ community may not matter. Like Black trans lives matter, Black gay lives matter. We're like in the Black Lives Matter movement, we all matter. And so I think as far as Black feminists or womanists being a part of it, I think that is also a deeper conversation that relates to sexism, that relates to colorism and things of that nature as well. But my question to that is, why wouldn't we matter? Because we do.
Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, and then Carmen, I'll let you ask your question.
Yes, it's clear that, I'm really glad that Leah mentioned, how the Black Lives Matter came about, who originated it. And at the end of the day, one of the things we have to think about, the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, we spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection of race, class, gender, and other types of identities, because when you think about oppressions are all related to one another. And there's a whole structure around, what oppression is. And so if there's sexism, there's also going to be racism. If there's ableism, there's also going to be issues relating to that. So one of the things that I think is really important when we think about this is, even as I've been watching the news over the last couple of weeks, there are times when I hear people saying, Black men, Black men, Black men. And I am not under any circumstances not going to say that, Black men are the biggest targets. But what I think is really important is that we don't forget in that narrative that, as I mentioned before, we're talking about children, babies, pregnant women. We're talking about trans people. We're talking about LGBT. We're talking about all these different groups. And if we don't acknowledge the fact that this is a Black full-on problem, and that means all Black people in this community are impacted by police violence, whether it is them directly impacted, which they all are, but that there's also, again, this indirect piece of it. I mean, the reason why there's a couple of organizations that I think are really, really important is the Black Women's Blueprint. There's also the African American Policy Forum. There are a number of both local organizations as well as national organizations that are taking the time to make sure that, women of color are involved in this. And the reason I say all this at the end of the day is that if we as a Black community cannot recognize the harm that is coming to all of us, then we can't fully advocate for our community as a whole to do what needs to be done. So I'm glad, I'm very, very glad that Rosanna brought that question to the fore. And I think that, the last thing that I want to say in reference to actions that I didn't get to say is that we have to continually keep this conversation going about what is happening right now. The energy is very, very strong right now. And again, I'm taking a watchful waiting approach, sort of a medical term, because I am still not sure whether this is going to sustain. I feel I'm more hopeful than I ever was before. And that means that we have to keep the pressure up. That means that at the end of the day, wherever we happen to be, we have to make sure that we just keep saying it over and over and over. I don't care. You know what? Any meeting that I'm in at this point, I am going to bring it up. And that might not be something that people are going to be thrilled with, but we have to keep the pressure on. And I'm going to say one other thing. We are a institution, a minority serving institution, University of Massachusetts. So here at the University of Massachusetts, we really, really owe it to ourselves to keep this conversation going. That means thinking about how we are teaching our students, what's in our curriculum, our pedagogy, what are we doing in our offices of diversity, equity, inclusion. All of this makes a difference. So I always say, we have to start at home, because I think sometimes what ends up happening is we get so enamored in terms of looking on the outside, which we absolutely must do. But wherever we are, as Joseph was mentioning, wherever we are, whether we're voting, we're organizing, whatever we're doing, we need to think about our internal circles, including UMass Boston.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. And Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, you're actually addressing one of the questions that was brought forward, like what can we as UMass Boston do in addressing these barriers? We mentioned about, as faculty, I know many faculty are here today, looking at our curriculum and ways that we can embed how to address race and gender bias, etc. Also, if you're a white person and you're mentoring students of color, how can you better relate to these students of color? So it's definitely, things that we can do as a body. I mean, we always, mention how we're recently we're the third most diverse university in the country, which is wonderful. And so in knowing that identity, it also creates opportunities for us as a student and faculty and staff body. Carmen, would you unmute yourself and give us your question or comment?
Hi, thank you. I actually did want to make a little comment, going back to why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important and why the emphasis should be on Black lives. And this is more coming from being a person of color, being a Latina. There are conversations being had in our own group, or, there's a lot of brown POC communities that are asking, like, why not us? Like, we're also experiencing oppression, or we have experienced oppression, but it's very important as a ally and as a brown person to have these conversations with our families. It's not a matter about who was more oppressed or who experienced more oppression, but it's acknowledging that there is a huge contrast in the lived experience of Black people and brown people. We don't have to worry about walking outside and being seen as a threat. We don't have to worry about our children not coming home. And that is so hard to see. And I'm sorry I'm getting emotional, but it's really, really difficult to know that we live in a country where people are walking out and people are being targeted and they're not coming back. So I just want to encourage for our brown POC folk to have a conversation with our families, with our friends that are challenging this movement or that are making certain comments, because the reality is that there is racism that exists within our POC community that is internal and it is towards other groups. But I think that in order for us to move forward, we need to have these very tough conversations and challenge the colorism that exists in our own communities. And when we continually perpetuate stereotypes and we have these conversations and think it's something funny when it's not. So I just want to bring that as an action item, as a way for us to continue moving forward, for other POC individuals to not just think that saying Black Lives Matter is enough, but like to actually do something about it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Carmen. That definitely needed to be said. And, I do love the way you framed it. I want to build off on that, and talk about action items. So I want to go, we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to go around the panel and ask for, perhaps one action item that you would provide our students with that they can take with them when they leave this place, and look forward to tomorrow and the days, weeks, months, and years ahead? What's one action item that you think is important for them to be mindful of moving forward? And then I will close this out. Who would like to begin? Kara.
Yeah, so as a young person, you know, I just turned 22, and my generation and the generations after me are heavily into social media. And I think that once, you know, we see something, it's easy to just like, it's easy to retweet, it's easy to repost. And I think that is one action that is very important, because it lets people know what is actually happening. I know a lot of my followers are Black. I know a lot of my friends' followers are Black, but I also do have white followers and, you know, other people of color. And I think that by seeing, you know, certain tactics and seeing petitions being signed and seeing just how easy it is to be at your fingertips, like, why would you not do it? You know, so I think that is a definitely an important action that we as young people can do, is just spread the word out as easily as possible. We're on our phones all the time. We're on watching TV all the time. And I think that that is one of the main reasons why we know about George Floyd, why we know about Breonna Taylor, why we know about these people, is because of social media. And I think that that's definitely one of the most important ways that we can raise awareness about this and take action to it.
Thank you, Kira. Dr. Nsiah Jefferson, if you could give one action item, what would it be?
Take care of yourself. I think it's critically important. I know that, you know, some of the work I did at one point was really looking at, you know, the health and well-being of activists, people who really, really cared about what was going on in the world. And I think everyone on this call is on this call because they really, really care. And I would look at this in two ways. I would give advice for everyone, general advice for everyone, but I'd also want to give advice for people of color, because again, as Anne brought up, you know, the pain is incredibly intense. So I think for all of us, you know, and I think you've, you know, read this and heard this, you know, take some time away from social media, from television. I mean, I am guilty of watching CNN 5 hours a day sometimes, if not more, going to sleep. Have conversations with your colleagues and your friends that understand what you're thinking, because having those conversations with people where it's controversial, yes, sometimes it will help you sharpen your thinking, but it can be very tense. So I think you balance between those who are supportive and are encouraging you to do the work that you need to do. Find the support that you need. Learn, grow, listen. All of those things are really important. And if you feel like you're getting to a point where you're becoming anxious and you're becoming depressed, then make sure that you're seeking some kind of professional help, because this can in many ways trigger something within you, particularly if it's underlying. And so, but what I'd like to say to people of color who are dealing with this, is it's particularly hard. And one thing I want to say, and I have to say it to myself too, is do not oversubscribe yourself. You will be called to talk and to speak and to, how do you feel? You will have people saying, what can I do? And at the end of the day, you don't always have those answers. You don't always have that strength to do those kinds of things. Be kind to yourself, figure out what your limits are, and do only that. Again, find individuals in your community. There's a lot of Black women's roundtables that I'm connecting with right now, where I can begin to be with people who are of like mind. So basically what I'm saying is rest, have conversation, have support, act. And then if you're a spiritual being, this is a good place to use your spirituality. So again, the main thing is to take care of yourself and define the ways that work best for you.
Thank you, Dr. Nsiah Jefferson. Definitely sound advice. Handel, what action item would you give to your peers before we leave today?
One of the action items that I would give, this is something I've actually tried to also incorporate into my life, is to unite as much as possible in any way that you can as a student. One of the things that I've done is forming a group chat that allows for people to uplift each other, so that they can just basically give themselves a safe space where they can encourage each other, educate, and just share a platform that embodies positivity. So that's one of the action items that I can say for students at the very least. I mentioned one of the action items I suggested for people who are possibly like in positions where they can allow for discussion boards or uh, discussions that allow for funding for people of color. So I think that's the best way I can put it.
Thank you, and thank you for providing these resources. A number of resources have been placed in the chat box. Just a note, we will be sending a ton of resources to the people on the call because we do want this to be actionable, and that we understand, how we can affect social change, and really know what are the steps moving forward. And so we will be distributing a number of resources that came from our panelists, from other leaders within our university. We'll be distributing those after this talk as well as the recording. Dr. Gordon, action item, what are your thoughts?
Keep your foot on the gas. This is a moment that we cannot let pass. I know that Mr. Floyd was put to rest, but what is going on is still unrest for us, and keeping our foot on the gas, keeping the momentum behind the reform and the change we want to be and see is imperative. Looking inward and also doing a little bit of research with regards to history. If there's something that you want to understand more about a culture, look into that. I think I saw somebody in the chat say that they're actually changing up their whole paper because of this conversation today. And I think that's amazing, right? And to me, that's a way to keep your foot on the gas, because now you're a little bit more enlightened, you're gonna do a little bit more in-depth research, and you're gonna bring some things that may not have been discussed in your class to the forefront. And I think that's excellent. So keep your foot on the gas, keep the momentum up. And remember that the somnolence of racism in America, hopefully that day is over. And we are now in a place where we really need to elevate this topic and continue that forward momentum in addressing so many things that racism affects.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Dr. Cooper, can you close us out?
Yes, I just want to echo the sentiments of all the panelists. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your day for being engaged. Hopefully there were things that were shared that are inspiring and encouraging for you. As I mentioned earlier, our actions and our inactions change the world every day. And our pursuit of a better world is something that's constant. Similarly, if you're seeking to be an anti-racist, an anti-sexist, it's not a static being, it's a constant thing. So you could be racist and sexist in one instance, in another instance be anti-racist and anti-sexist. So just be conscious. So in terms of just the one action item, I would challenge everybody just to review the resources that we provided in the chat and select one of those resources to review. And I'd like for each of you to individually write your own action items. We don't want to tell you what to do. We just want to provide you with resources so that you decide what is the way in which you want to go about change. So just kind of an acronym that I always like to use is ARCA. Number one is awareness. So that is a part of educating yourself. So become aware of issues. Once you're aware, I want you to reflect on them. Sit down and reflect. Some of the groups that are highlighted in certain conversations, as Carmen mentioned, it's really not an oppression Olympics. I can promise you as a Black man, prefer our group to not be discussed as frequently as we are. It's not a badge of honor. It's not a medal to be rated in some of these statistics the way that we are, mortality rates, incarceration rates. So some of the groups that are focused on is because of the magnitude of the oppression. And as we're talking about, it affects our communities collectively. After the reflection, the third thing you should do is connect. Connect with, as Dr. Jefferson and Dr. Gordon mentioned, connect with organizations and connect with people who can help with your holistic well-being and with concerted efforts to address the issue. And the last thing, you have to act. Just like we say silence can be a form of complicity, inaction can be a form of complicity as well. So doing nothing is actually a part of the problem as well. The only way the world gets better is that courageous people take action. And before you take action, you should be informed about what's going on, reflect on what you should do, connect with others who can help you, and then you engage in that action and then do it all over again, as well as rejuvenating your spirits in various ways. So thank you all again. I believe all of our contact information is available. So if you'd like to follow up with any of us, please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. And also, I know I've gotten some messages on the side from many of our Brown participants. We want to continue to have this discussion. I'm confident that our Dean Thompson would like to continue to have this, as well as several of the other deans at our university. So the Race Revelations series can continue, and we definitely want to partner with you in that effort. So please reach out to me. Please reach out to me just to let me know I'm here. I want to work with you, and I'm definitely happy to help support these efforts, as I'm sure the panelists are, and some of our many of our colleagues and students and staff on the call as well. So we'll send you the resources. We didn't get to a lot of the questions, and I apologize for that. I think I got to about a third of the questions that I had written down, but this is good to have this dialogue and discussion, but just know that it will be one of many to come. And so we will be having future talks. One last thing I wanted to introduce you all. I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting today that there may be some emotions that are elicited by having these discussions. Please know that there is help available. Dr. Monique Cooper, are you on the call? I'd like for you to introduce yourself and just
Sure.
let the students know that you're here in the event that they would like to reach out to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen to put my contact information up here. This was such a wonderful event. I'd like to echo the thank yous that have been going around. It's great to have a space like this for folks to educate one another and share their insights. And I know that, you know, enduring racial battle fatigue and enduring this fight for social justice can be very exhausting, both emotionally, physically, and mentally. And I'd just like to echo the comments of the panel is that you have to take care of yourself. You have to put your mask on first sometimes before you can begin to really help others. And you will be your best self when you do that. So my name is Monique Cooper. I work in the College of Nursing and Health Science as the Director of Student Success Support and Engagement. And students, I am available to you if you'd like to have dialogue further around this conversation. If you just need to talk things out, if you need additional resources, certainly reach out to me. My contact information is here for you. We've also sent out resources in the chat to the Google document that has a ton of resources. If you review that and you want to further the dialogue, again, I implore you to reach out to your peers as well as your faculty members, as well as other staff, both within the college and the university broadly, to have those conversations. So fantastic job and wonderful moderating. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, and thank you again to all the panelists, students. Thank you to all of our faculty who came to listen and learn. I really do appreciate your efforts in that way. And thank you to our staff as well. Until next time, stay safe, be blessed.